Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Today, we're going to talk about Reboot. I think the Reboot show. Just because I was thinking about this, I can't remember what exactly got me on this subject, but I figured I'd talk about it. I kind of debated a little bit because I recently watched like all the Lilo and Stitch movies with Claudia, and like I don't know, I don't really have a lot to say about them, but the last Stitch movie was just really kind of like hilariously bad. For the fact that like the first two movies were like, oh yeah, these are Disney movies. Like Stitch Has a Glitch wasn't really all that amazing, but then like this Stitch movie was just like, all right, your budget is canceled. Like make a film, but do it without any money at all. And so like all the characters are just like standing perfectly still. Like their faces barely animated. It's just weird. It's like they all got like their faces are frozen. They got what is it? The botulinum whatever. They got face jobs and they just can't move their faces right now. Their faces are so tired. Like, I'm so frightened, Lilo, that I can't even move my face right now. I wish you could see the expression here. So yeah, but other than that, I don't really have anything to say about it. So I was going to talk about Reboot. Another thing I was going to talk about today, but I don't really have very much to go into it. I have a Wacom that I work on. Apparently, Toon Boom is a little bit weird because they only support Wacom, and you can use other types of tablets, other brands, and there's a chance it'll work on Toon Boom, but only Wacom does it work. In fact, I was gonna try and get like one of those neat like Surface tablet things, and I got like a Huion brand because like the Wacom is like $2,000 and then the Huion was like $800. So it was like a better deal to get this Huion brand. But then the Huion brand didn't work with Toon Boom, and I had to send it back. Like it just flat out did not work. And so today, like, I had to uninstall drivers and then reinstall drivers and get, all the Wacom stuff set up again. And today, I was trying to use my Wacom and, like, the tablet didn't work. It goes tablet not found. And this is the thing, like, if you've never used a tablet before, like, you don't know the pain of trying to use a Wacom tablet. Like, it's one of the most expensive brands on the market, but it so reliably doesn't work. Like, it's just, like, notorious for that. Everyone who's ever used a Wacom tablet is just like, oh, yeah, tablet driver's not found. I know how that is. If you haven't experienced this, you are in a very fortunate minority. But, man, like, the tablet drivers wouldn't work, and so I went into, like, the services section of my computer, and I was, like, turning the drivers on and off. I restarted my computer like twice, then I like uninstalled the drivers and then reinstalled the drivers, and it still couldn't find the drivers, and I restarted the computer again, and finally, so like after an hour of like uninstalling and reinstalling and restarting my computer, I finally got the tablet working again, and now I can go back to work. It just kind of cracks me up because I was just like looking it up, and I was like looking up all these different permutations of like Wacom driver not working, and like there's no real fixes for it. Like no one really understands specifically what's causing it. Wacom least of all apparently, because it's been going on for like years, longer than I've been drawing. And like I don't know, I just thought it was funny. Like I was gradually like typing in more and more angry permutations of like Wacom drivers not working. I was like, Wacom drivers are very bad. Wacom drivers are the worst. Wacom drivers are Hitler. And, I kept finding hits for each stage of frustration. Because, you invest in one of these things and it's just sort of like, oh my god, how can this be the most expensive brand on the market and also be the least reliable brand on the market? Everything I do is like, man, the whole animation and art, it's all kind of like a niche sort of thing. And or niche. It's all just it's a specialist kind of thing. Not a lot of people really do it, for a living, and so there's just like one or two company that supports everything that you do. And when they screw up, when they're stupid and they can't fix anything, you just get stuck with. So yeah. Anyway, on the note of computers, Reboot. See, there's totally perfect, totally reasonable segue. So yes, Reboot. Reboot was a show that was on when I was a kid, and I used to really love this show as a kid. It was the first ever 3D animated cartoon series, and it was about these guys that lived inside a computer, and every now and then the computer user used to like summon down a game, and this like GameCube would come down, and it would suck up all these little characters, which represented like ones and zeros inside your computer, and it would force them to play games for your amusement. And then like you'd run around and you'd be like shooting things in your shooter games, and you would just be like gunning down all these little ones and zeros, who in the context of this show had their own like lives and everything like that. Like, they had families and jobs and stuff like that. They did like their 9 to 5, and then every now and then the user just wanted to play a game and just murdered everyone. So the user was seen as like this great, like, all-powerful Satan figure, which always I thought was really kind of amusing and really sort of clever, because occasionally they made jokes. Like, I know that they had one episode where they were like playing a zombie game and there was a lot of gore, and they were like, what kind of disgusting people would play a game like this? And then they all like look at the camera, you know. It's a excuse me, it's been a fourth wall breaking kind of thing. But yeah, the reason I got into this show, I can't even remember what network specifically played Reboot, but I got into it because I had a friend who grew up in a very, very strict puritanical family. But his dad was a computer engineer, and he was only allowed to, I kind of got this out of order, this would have made more sense if I'd gotten this backwards. He was only allowed to watch particular shows that his parents approved of. Like, they had to watch the show and see that the show was okay, and that the show didn't say anything that Jesus wouldn't approve of. But his dad was a computer engineer. There, see, now I have it in the right order. So yes, but his dad was a computer engineer, and that meant that his dad was kind of was amused by the whole concept of Reboot. Like, he sort of liked the idea of like, oh, there's this computer world. So my friend was allowed to watch Reboot along with his other Christian programming. So he really loved Reboot because this is the thing, is like he was probably one of my more destructive and mischief-prone friends, because he grew up in this kind of puritanical environment. Like, he was restricted from doing virtually everything, so whenever he got an opportunity to do virtually anything, he cherished that opportunity. You know, like, he was one of those kids that always wanted to set everything on fire. Not even necessarily because he loved fire that much, but because he just knew that, like, you know, this was his opportunity to do it, and if he didn't take it, when he went home, he was going to have to refrain from that. Like, he played Warhammer with me, Warhammer Fantasy, when I was a kid, and I remember him playing the Dark Elves, not really because he thought that they were cool, but explicitly because they were elves, and he knew I was going to play demons, and so the way he told it is he's like, oh no, Mom, like, the Dark Elves are fighting the demons. Like, we're the demon fighters, Greg plays as the demons. And so he didn't really tell her that they were also, like, the debauched demon-worshipping elves, you know, and this demon incursion was probably their own doing in the first place, because the Dark Elves are stupid like that, stupid and evil. But, yeah. So Reboot, though, he was really into Reboot. And they were inspired kind of by the design of, like, motherboards, because back then computers were a lot more bulky, and so you used to, like, you'd see all their little parts sticking out, and they had, like, these little towers and things like that, and it was actually pretty cool looking, those old motherboards. They would look like a city in a lot of ways. They had all these little avenues, because you had to have all the circuits go into all these different little parts, and so you had, like, roadways for all the circuits to go to. So it was just kind of neat to look at, and I remember my friend, his dad gave him, like, old motherboards, and my friend actually used to, like, he named them, and I think, like, he actually painted little stuff from the show on some of these, like, spare motherboards that his dad gave him, and he just thought that was all kind of cool, and I thought that was kind of cool too, and that's how I got into the show. So I would go over to my friend's house and we would watch Reboot together. And yeah, the main characters were Bob, the Guardian, who I'm not quite sure what exactly his deal was, because they were inspired by computers, but they didn't really stick to computers entirely, which is probably to their benefit. But I think that Bob was like a virus shield. He was like, you know, Norton Security, or like I don't know what else was big in that time. McAfee, I think, was big at that time. You know, he was like Norton Security or McAfee, you know, the good guys. and there were two viruses that lived in the computer, Megabyte, which, because back in that time, Megabyte was like a huge amount of data. If you had, like, you know, 100 megabytes on your computer, then your computer was full. You know, you could not store any more data on this computer. So, like, Megabyte was this very powerful virus that lived on the computer, and, you know, I guess he took up a lot of space because, you know, back then a megabyte was a lot of data. And then there was a character named Hexadecimal, and I think Hexadecimal was a virus because if you screwed up a hexadecimal value, then your whole computer got really wonky. So she was like kind of a weird, like, sometimes she was a villain, sometimes she wasn't, you know, she was just kind of chaotic. That was her whole spiel. And Hexadecimal was interesting because she had, like, this mask, and she would just, like, flip her hands over her face to, like, change her expression. And I don't wonder, I bet actually that probably saved some animation time. I mean, like, moving the hands around takes some effort, but, like, faces are complicated, and so if you can just, like, oh, we changed the face, and you know, she has a different face. That was probably kind of handy for them. And also kind of cool from just a character sort of perspective. Megabyte, the very large virus, he was blue. He was blue. He had a big lower jaw, and he didn't have legs. This was kind of a weird thing too. Like, I never really understood exactly how this worked. But he didn't have legs, or he did. But like, he had like a hover chair that he could sit in, and he didn't like just like sit in the hover chair. What he would do is he would like take his legs off and then go and put himself in the hover chair. And by touching things, he could corrupt them and make them into like Megabyte-style things. But somehow they'd contained him in this one little sector of their city. And Megabyte was voiced by Tony J, which was like one of my first experiences with Tony J. This was the same guy who voices the Elder Squid in the Soul Reaver series and everything like that. And anyway, though, so Megabyte, he was a really cool villain. Tony J made him seem really intimidating and really cool. And he battled with Bob, the antivirus guy. And Bob dealt with the virus thing fairly often, but like with virtually every single episode without fail actually had to do with the games. So this was where this point of confusion always came for me, was although Bob was like an antivirus program and he was fighting the viruses, what it always felt like was more that he was a game program, and that he was just there to make games more challenging. Because whenever the user won a game, everyone in that sector would be dead, and I guess that was to represent, like, you know, losing system resources, which happens sometimes. I used to have a game I really loved called Streets of SimCity that, for whatever reason, caused terrible memory leaks and would just cause my system to eventually like crash over time. I would have to like restart the computer after playing Streets of SimCity. I don't know what caused that. It didn't initially do that. It started doing that, I think, after an operating system upgrade or something like that. I don't know. Computers, I don't know. But anyway, though, so yeah, so Bob focused more on playing games than stopping the user. And so that meant that every single episode of Reboot, they were doing like some different game, and there was kind of a different adventure going on. So that was kind of a cool backdrop, and if they wanted to stay in the computer world, they could. But most of the time, though, they were just in different games doing a different challenge and kind of solving a different sort of puzzle. With Bob having this advantage of a little tool he called Glitch, which he could just say, like, Glitch, become a spatula, and then Glitch would become a spatula. So Glitch could become anything, and he constantly used Glitch to cheat in the games, which was kind of a cute way of explaining, like, oh, you know, like AI rubber banding in a racing game, you know? It's not that they just catch up to you, it's that Bob uses Glitch to make, like, an afterburner or something like that fires him ahead of the user, and then the user's gotta, like, catch up to him. But yeah, this user was apparently really bad at video games, because if you went by the show, the show ran for like multiple seasons, and the user almost never won. And whenever he won, it was a huge tragedy. So they really, like, you know, the good guys won in Reboot a lot of times, so the user didn't win very often. But as the show started to go on, though, I remember it started to get to where it seemed like they wanted to get more gritty. Their animation style started to improve a lot. You got to see less weird shortcuts and kind of more aesthetically appealing kinds of things. And then they started to get into, like, well, Bob is now battling with Megabyte more. Like, this whole, like, Megabyte being on the server thing is coming more to the forefront. And the internet opens up. And this I also thought was funny, because the internet was, like, a horrible place in Reboot. And they were absolutely right about this. But, like, they get on the internet, which I believe they called the web. And I think they differentiated. They had, like, the web and the net. And I think, like, the net was the computer network that the computer was connected to. Like, I don't know, maybe this was a work computer or something like that, and this guy was just playing all these games on the work computer, and that's why he wasn't very good at the games, because, you know, he only played them at work, and it was like a different game every single time, and, you know, it wasn't like a kid. Or it could have been a small kid, who knows. And then I think the web was, like, you know, the actual internet, you know, the World Wide Web or whatever. I don't know. Because there's network, but I'm pretty sure they didn't use them interchangeably. I don't think the net was the web. I think they were separate things. But anyway, though, he opens up to the internet, and the internet is just awful. And so everything that comes from the internet is like trying to destroy the whole server. It's just like, you know, whatever Megabyte was doing was nowhere near as bad as like what the internet was doing. And so what they wind up doing is they shoot Bob off into the internet, and he's gone. And that's how they kind of end one season. So then they come back and they have this other little character, Enzo. And I've heard a couple of stories as to how this character Enzo got introduced into the series. Like, he was actually there from the very beginning, but he was like a little boy with like a hat on, and he worshipped Bob. And the story that I've heard for how they came up with this Enzo character was they were like, well, you know, so we've got Bob, but we need something for the kids to hang on to, you know, a kid character, you know, some little Enzo boy. And then, you know, like Enzo was like an Italian name or something like that, and one of their producers was Italian or something. So he's just like, yeah, some little Enzo kid, you know, like some little Billy kid. And so they were like, oh, okay, Enzo. And so they just like got Enzo in there, and his sister Dot, who is Bob's love interest. So he was like, he was Bob's love interest's little brother. Ran around with Bob for most of the episodes and was kind of like, he was like Aqualad or whatever. He got captured all the time, or he got put in bad spots, and Bob had to rescue him. So he kind of created tension, and he asked Bob questions so that Bob had to tell him, you know, what was going on and whatever. Like, he'd be like, oh man, Bob, I don't understand this. You'll have to explain it for me, and also the audience. So Bob would kind of do that. So Enzo wound up being a valuable part of the show because he provided that sort of like audience surrogate kind of thing. And anyway, though, so once Bob was gone, the show had been going on for long enough that I guess Enzo really didn't have a whole lot more questions that he needed to ask, or, you know, if he did, the writers were just like, you know what, it's fine. Bob is gone. Bob is dead. Now only Enzo. And it was pretty amusing because Enzo continued to be terrible. Like, it wasn't like, I don't know, Teen Titans where, like, Aqualad is kind of badass or whatever because now that he's standing alone, he's fine. It was kind of like Aqualad still in Aquaman's shadow and still totally incompetent, and he gets captured and now there's no Aquaman to save him. So like right away, like they just kind of do this thing where they're like, yeah, they're like, Enzo, he's now the Guardian. Enzo is now the virus shield. And so like one of the first games he goes into, it's not like the very first, but one of the really early games, like I don't know if it was like third, fourth game, whatever, really early on into the series, he goes into a game and it's like Mortal Kombat and he just gets flattened. So like the Mortal Kombat thing, it does this finisher where it like pokes out his eye, and then they kind of kick into the next series and they do this whole fast forward thing, and it's like Enzo's all grown up and he's like running around and they're in a completely new environment. It's like a totally new show. It was really weird, and like I actually went back and I watched it as an adult, and it doesn't. A certain amount of nostalgia made the show really good for me, but it actually was fairly well put together, and on a second watching at an older age, it still holds up pretty well. But you can definitely feel like they had this sort of intent here, like this was a thing that they wanted to do, and they sat down, they planned it out, and they had this whole story arc, where like Enzo's traveling around from computer to computer to computer, and he does so, or it might actually be just across the network, he may not be on the internet, I'm not really sure. Again, I don't know, I don't get it. Because he travels through the GameCubes is what happens, is the GameCube leaves with him, and he's got like a special thing on so that he doesn't die from the game doing this. But it keeps dropping him off into other computers. And so he like, you know, each of these different computers have different things going on. Like one computer has, it's been eaten up by viruses almost completely. Like viruses are more common than the little people that live there. And it continues kind of in the same formula, really, if you think about it, where they're kind of going from like, oh, new adventure, like a new setting and a new challenge every single episode, but now they're doing it kind of in the sense of like, well, this is real and not a game, you know. So they really didn't, although they changed their cast up and everything like that, they didn't really like lose their cast members so much as they just kind of changed them, and then changed the way the format was being delivered, but maintained that same exact format. And I remember, when we first saw, like, in Season 3, when we were like, like, well, My Little Pony, they're gonna make Twilight a princess. And I pointed out, I was like, well, you know, like, it's not like there's no precedent for a show making this totally, like, wild and important change to a character and getting away with it. I mean, like, look at Reboot. And, you know, years later, I kind of look back at that and I say, like, well, I mean, like, Reboot clearly had a plan. I don't know so much about this princess thing now that all's been seen, said, and done. But yeah. So Reboot kind of went along, and they had like this fully grown, like eyeless Enzo with like a gun, running around shooting people, and he had like this girl with him, and she was like this busty orange girl with the starfish in her hair. So they traveled around the internet, and they found Bob. They found Bob in the internet. He was out there. I don't exactly understand what he was doing. Being a virus guard, like again, you get into this kind of stuff where it's like he's a virus shield. He was like being Norton's security off in the internet. He was fighting viruses out in the whatever this is, this whole abstraction. I don't even know exactly, but there was like this big virus that had infected the virus shield, which I mean, like I guess you could do It would be kind of interesting to have a virus do that, but I don't know what the purpose would be other than just like destruction. Or well, I mean, I guess viruses do that. They usually lock up your file. But I think that what her plan was, if I recall correctly, what her plan was is she started by infecting the virus shield, and then she traveled to the entire rest of the internet. I think she crossed the entire world, because at one point they showed like what the map of her conquest looked like, and it was just like the planet. So it was like, oh, she's everywhere. And so once she'd infected every single computer, I think that her plan was just to format the hard drives of all computers connected to the internet simultaneously. And I think the like mainframe was the last computer that had not died yet. And somehow they'd put up this incredible firewall, which this virus was not able to get through. And again, you have to think about this like in the context of like, okay, so there's a user. Was like the user, like, did he get older and he was like suddenly really good at like computer security? Or was it that he just never turned his computer on, never hooked up to the internet? Like his parents couldn't afford internet, so he just was never connected. You know, therefore he could never get the virus. Like, what was the deal? I don't know exactly. But the point is that his computer was the last computer on Earth that had not been infected by this virus. And I don't recall how they resolved this now, because it's been a while since I rewatched it. But apparently they killed the virus. They did not get reformatted, or the whole world didn't get reformatted. And then after that, I think they tried to keep going for a while, and I don't know really what happened to Reboot after that. But I've heard news that they're thinking about restarting Reboot and doing another thing with it. And nothing ever really came of that. And I suppose, I feel like it's probably for the best. We've been seeing a lot of reboots, and sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad. But Reboot's one of those shows that was kind of like, I don't know, it was like special to me as a kid. Like, I grew up, like, I was pretty young when I saw that. It was totally unique. It was one of the only shows that was like that. And, I mean, it becomes dated because computer technology is moving forward. But it was sort of a different era. That sort of, like, the idea of, like, a computer and, like, using a computer being kind of mystical and sort of anthropomorphizing everything. I mean, it was just a different time. Like, everyone was just becoming acquainted with computers as a part of their everyday life. You know, I don't think there were even such a thing as laptops at that time. I mean, like, it was a big deal. Like, computers used to write random access memory to your hard drive and stuff like that. There were so many things that computers did differently. And I feel like if you tried to modernize the whole idea of Reboot, it would be a way different feel. Like, I don't know if you could really go back to that. You could just keep doing the exact same thing that Reboot did, but it would be a little different. But anyway, though, I suppose now is a good time to go ahead and wrap things up. So thanks for joining me, everybody. I'll catch you all next time.